Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Bent Limbs podcast. I am your host, Matt Thielking, and today on episode number 6, I'm going to be running solo, and we're going to cover everybody's favorite topic and hopefully get some people fired up. We're going to talk broadheads and broadheads for crossbows. We're going to talk about kind of my experiences and my journey of different broadheads and kind of where I've ended up now. I've shot both fixed blades and mechanicals, and I've had good and bad experiences with both. But ultimately, I've learned some things along the way, and that's what I want to share with you guys. Um, I guess before we get started, I want to lay out a couple ground rules here. So I know everybody's got their own opinion on broadheads, and that is great. And everybody's got different experiences and things that they like and things that they absolutely hate. And that is totally cool. But what I want to establish is in the comment section down below, if you guys are going to post a comment, rule number 1 is no bashing. All right. Everybody shoots different stuff for different reasons. So no bashing other people based on their setups. If you bash someone or say somebody else's setup or this broadhead sucks or whatever like that, I'm just going to delete your comment. Number 2, and I want you guys, if you can, listen to this podcast and then wait to comment, because I want this to be not just my opinion, but also you guys sharing your opinions and your experiences in that comment section. And I want you guys to add a little bit of meat and context to why you shoot the broadhead that you do. And I think you'll see the type of meat and context that I'm looking for after you listen to this, after I kind of talk about some of my experiences and the factors that I now consider more important than some other factors. So that's what I want you guys to do. I don't want you to just say Schwacker broadheads rule and I've killed deer at 100 yards with them. Like that really doesn't add anything for anyone. I want you to say something like, I shoot Schwackers because, I've had some bad experiences hitting deer back, and I like a bigger cutting diameter versus the smaller cutting diameter of a fixed blade. And the blade deployment on the Schwacker seems to be the best that I've used, and they fly like field points, blah, 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 blah. That's just an example, but I want something with some meat, something with some guts, something with some content to it. If you're going to post the broadheads that you use. All right. So I guess just to, start this off, I have killed more deer with a mechanical, both compound and crossbow with a mechanical. Straight up, I shot Rage 2-blade chisel tips, the regular 2-inch cut, for a long time, and I killed a lot of deer with those. Um, I have also I have lost 5 deer, um, 5 deer in my hunting career. Wounded. Some I think made it, others I don't think made it. Um, four of those, 5 were with mechanicals. Um, three, no, 4 of them were with a compound, but 1 was with a crossbow. And I have more, I guess I should say, I have more compound bow kills than I do crossbow. But as of late, I have more crossbow. But total, compound takes the cake, at least for me. And I really do believe that every single broadhead, every single one works, and they all have killed deer, and every single one has failed or has not worked the way that the shooter wanted it to and has lost deer. So they've all killed deer and they've all lost deer. But I definitely think, and I've definitely learned and experienced some things where I now look at broadheads a little bit differently. So I made just kind of a quick list that I wanted to start with. As far as a few, I just kind of labeled it advantages and disadvantages of each. And I more made it I guess it'd be more of like an advantage, like which type of broadhead has the upper hand as far as mechanical versus fixed blade. We'll start with mechanicals. Really the two that I think, and I think the two that most people weigh very heavily when they choose a mechanical or why they favor a mechanical. And they're two good ones. They really are. and it flies either the same or very, very close to your field point. I mean, there's no doubt, you know, a mechanical flies better than a fixed blade in general because it's just got a smaller profile out at the front of your bolt or front of your arrow, and it's got less wind resistance, it's less drag, it's all that stuff. So naturally, it's going to fly better. Um, and it has a larger cutting diameter. There's no doubt about that. I mean, even some of the smallest mechanicals, something in the like 1.5 inch cutting diameter range, that's fairly small for a mechanical. It's still bigger than almost all fixed blades with the exception of a few. So you definitely have the advantage in total cutting diameter with that mechanical. On the fixed blade side, for advantages, I had listed number one, structural integrity. And that one's kind of I would say, general term. I think there are some mechanicals that are built better than some fixed blades, but in general, fixed blade has more structural integrity than a mechanical, simply because it has no moving parts, and it has less parts a lot of times. So fixed blade structural integrity definitely gets the nod. Number two, you have better odds of going through bone. A couple reasons for that. You have a smaller cutting diameter, so you're simply trying to push less stuff through a hard surface. I mean, that's really it. You're pushing a smaller object through bone, and it you just don't have those big blades impeding your penetration through that bone. I think that, kind of tying along with that, I think a lot of times mechanicals, I don't want to say they're made with a worse material, but I think you can find fixed blades that are made out of premium materials. You look at things like the tough heads, or you look at things like iron will or cutthroats that's what I shot last year. You can get fixed blades in tool steels or some, high-end cutlery steels or some high-end stainlesses. And a lot of mechanicals, I honestly don't even know what some of them are made out of, outside of some of the higher end ones where they're titanium or better stainlesses. But I feel like in general, again, kind of a generalization, I give the nod to fixed blades for higher quality materials. And then, kind of along with the going through the bone, I have better penetration. And with that better penetration, I kind of equate that to, I'm going to call it a more gradual blade angle. So I guess I think of blade angle, and I hope this is the right terminology. If it's not, I guess this is mine for this podcast. Is if you look at your ferrule and you look at how steep your blades are, most times or oftentimes, in general, again, a fixed blade broadhead has a more gradual slope to the blade versus a mechanical. A lot of times, to get that big cutting diameter on a mechanical and to still keep the blades in a reasonable package to, be able to deploy and fit in a head that's, not super long. A lot of mechanicals have a steeper blade angle. So that more gradual blade angle, but just that blade angle being more gradual, I say better penetration. Again, there are some mechanicals that penetrate great, that probably penetrate better than some fixed blades, but overall, I would give the nod to the fixed blades. So those are kind of the things that I look at. I think a lot of people look at when they're weighing mechanical versus fixed blade. So again, just to recap, mechanical flies like a field point, flies the best, and the larger cutting diameter, opening up a bigger wound channel. Fixed blade side of things, structural integrity, better penetration, with that better odds of going through bone, and again, in general, higher quality materials. So, my hunting career, it started with fixed blades. The first broadhead I ever shot was the old Nap Thunderhead, and I didn't know a lick about arrow tuning or anything. I was a 12-year-old kid that was just jacked up to go bow hunting. I remember shooting those things, and they flew like like there was a wiffle ball strapped to the end of my arrow. And I never shot a deer with that. I missed one, I think more for nerves, not broadhead or arrow flight. And I remember my youth pastor showing me first mechanical I ever saw. It was the NAP Spitfire. Still a very common head, still a good head, a head that's been used a lot, that's killed a lot of deer. And I remember thinking, man, that is slick, that is cool. I tried them; they flew great. I killed my first bow deer with mechanical. It was a little spike, and I was kind of from that point on. I was like, I mean, it was kind of a no-brainer for me that I'm going to shoot mechanicals. Why not? You got this bigger cut; they fly great. Um, it was a no-brainer. And as I progressed in my hunting career, there were probably a few times where I had some things happen where I recovered deer, but some things were just kind of a little goofy. Couple of examples. I One of the best bucks to date for me was a buck I shot when I lived down in Texas. I was hunting from a ground blind. This buck came in. He was only, I don't know, probably between like 15, 18 yards, something like that. I mean, he was close, perfectly broadside. Touched off my arrow, zipped right through, right where I wanted to go. Did a big mule kick, and I was like, awesome, like perfect. This should be easy track job, and it wasn't at all. It was a really weird, kind of scenario of like even my arrow when I found it, it didn't have a ton of blood on it at the time. So I was shooting that broadhead was a G5. I think they were called the T3s at the time. The name might have changed. I know the design. The G5 still has one very similar. I think a different blade retention than what those T3s used to have with the little spring-loaded kind of spider clips. Um, I guess kind of to make a long story short on that one, we didn't recover him until the next day. And down in Texas, that is a problem because it was freaking hot still. I mean, it was mid-October. It's still mid 80s down there. And, we were able to salvage probably about half of the meat. But when we got up to that deer, it literally looked like you had stuck a pencil through him. I mean, I hit him right where I wanted to, and it just pencil holed him. I mean, and it killed him, but there was probably some user error on my part, but I didn't really like the design of those spider clips because they were just finicky. I could never get them right where I wanted them. I felt like I was either, it felt like it had a lot of blade retention or it felt like it had none, and you basically just had to bend them yourself. That was one where, like, looking back, I probably should have looked a little closer into that. I switched broadheads, but that was one where I probably should have kind of started thinking, okay, do I need to make some changes in my hunting setup just in general? I killed a deer in college with a fixed blade, actually. And we played around with a bunch of stuff when I was in college. This would have actually even been before that Texas deer. And I had a great result with the, what were they? The Wasp SSTs or something, a pretty small cutting diameter, chisel tip 3 blade. Had great success with that. Killed a few deer, and then I kind of went back to fixed blades. And then I got on the Rage bandwagon. And I guess you guys, when I'm using brands and stuff, I just kind of want to tell you my story. I don't want to necessarily like leave out the broadheads that I was using. I'm really not knocking them because if you guys are having success with them, shoot them and keep shooting them. If you like them and they're doing what you want them to do, shoot them. But these were some of the things that I was noticing, and I guess sorry for that little segue, but back to the switch to the Rage. First deer I shot with that was a buck behind my house. It was actually the first buck I ever killed behind my house. and it's the longest shot I've ever made on a whitetail. It was with a compound. He was 40 yards. I absolutely drilled him, and I just remember being like, wow, this blood trail is like, I mean, it was insane. It was awesome. And I have really swampy property. I mean, we even got to a section when we were tracking them. I was pretty close to a big cattail marsh. It seriously looked like a scene from Jaws in the water that was in all these cattails. I mean, there was blood on like the cattail, you know, stalks and leaves and stuff, but even sections of like more water that he went through, you literally could see blood in the water. It was unreal. And I was sold on those things, and I had a lot of success on those for multiple years, and I just loved them. I was like, these are my broadhead, man. And a lot of my friends were kind of in the same boat. They liked them. They had success with them. We were sold on them. And then 2017 and 2019 rolled around. Were a couple of years where some things, happened. I had a doe that I shot with that same broadhead, that same Rage 2 blade, and she wasn't far. She was probably right about like 18 to 20 yards. And when I shot, she was fairly alert. And instead of ducking, she kind of just rolled a little bit, and my arrow still went right where I wanted it to. But it almost looked like it bounced off of her. It was a really weird, and we had it on video. It just looked really weird for me as the shooter, because I saw where my lighted knock went, and it was good, and then it was just like the arrow was bouncing on the ground. Like, it didn't even look like to me that it stuck in her. Um, and we kind of replayed the footage a little bit, and what had ended up happening was that I caught just the kind of like the back edge of her shoulder. She wheeled kind of towards me, so what turned into a pretty good broadside shot, or what was a pretty good broadside shot, turned into like a quartering two shot. And I caught kind of the like bottom edge of that scapula. I got probably, I want to say, I don't know, a foot of penetration or so when we got up to my arrow. Um, and it was a pretty long track job. I mean, it wasn't necessarily a bad one. It We had blood. We didn't have great blood, but we had it. And I want to say we went maybe like 250 yards, and we found my doe. When we cleaned her, though, the broadhead had basically, the blades had broken um, right where like the Rage broadhead blade support is. And you've kind of got like a little bit of like a tail of blade hanging out. Basically, both of those tails sheared off, so a 2-inch broadhead turned into I don't know, a little over an inch. And the blades inside of her were pretty chewed up. They were chipped. They were bent. So it got in there, and it got in there far enough, but it didn't do. I don't want to say it didn't do that great of a job, but it definitely was kind of something that I should have paid a little of attention to. And I had another one, actually, with a crossbow. Now, the one deer that I wounded with a crossbow, kind of the exact same scenario. I shot at a doe she was fairly alert. She was a little farther. I was actually on the ground on this one, and she ducked again, and instead of being elevated and getting, you know, the benefit of penetrating down into the deer's chest cavity, I hit the shoulder. I hit it pretty solid, and she ran off. And I never found her. I kind of had the same situation of blood. She actually ran. It was the same property, same stand, ran the same direction. Never found her. Again, I probably got about a half a bolt's worth of penetration, and just not having that downward angle, I mean, I pretty much think I hit high shoulder, maybe nicked the top of a lung or something, but not boiler room. And so I would imagine that broadhead, had I recovered it, it probably had kind of the same situation. But again, these are things that I was starting to experience, and it wasn't that I wasn't paying attention to them. I was kind of in the, it's partially my fault, if you want to put it at that, is, my arrow wasn't hitting, or my bolt wasn't hitting right where I wanted it to. But on the flip side, and we'll get into this in a minute, the deer were reacting to my shots. Um, in that same kind of time frame, I had a buck that I hit in the shoulder blade with. I was actually using a regular rage, not the chisel tip, and I whacked him in the shoulder, and it was like the arrow just stopped. I mean, the entire arrow was sticking out of his shoulder, and first couple bounds, it popped right out, and he was gone. I mean, we tracked him, but that was one that was like, it sounded like I smacked two 2x4s together. Like, it was loud, no penetration. He was fine. I mean, what we were tracking, you could tell the deer was walking, and he, he probably made it with a patched up left shoulder. But the one, despite all of these things, I was still pretty set on shooting those heads, because I had, even though I had some issues with them, or some experiences that didn't go the way I wanted to. Um, I kept shooting them because I also had great experiences with them. I also had gusher blood trails. I also had just, I mean, massive wound channels. So I kept rolling with them. And then that buck in 2019, that's the one that really, really changed the way I was thinking, or what I wanted to do. So my confidence level wasn't necessarily great heading into, this season, just because my results went from very mixed to, or sorry, very good to very mixed. And I had a deer in 2019 that was, like the perfect setup, perfect hunt. It was a late November morning. He came cruising through looking for does, and I got a really nice 20-yard shot at him. And he was quartering away, and this was with a compound. Um, and I remember watching that Luminok fly, and it was flying exactly where I wanted to. Like, I can see that in slow motion. Like, the release of that arrow, everything felt great. And the deer he didn't really react much. It wasn't like some of these other ones where the deer were ducking, or they were turning, or that kind of stuff. Everything felt great. And then I don't remember seeing like the impact happen, but what I do remember very vividly is seeing this deer bound just a couple bounds, not even like a deer that has been hit, just a couple like jumps, maybe like 3 or 4, like you just jumped him walking to your stand. And the arrow was sticking pretty far out of him, and it was very parallel to his body. Like, it was not how that arrow should have been sticking out based on, a nice quartering away shot, and where that arrow was heading. It was like it looked like I had taken like an extreme quartering away shot based on how that thing was sticking out of him. And I just remember being like, what the heck? That's weird. And I didn't hear anything. There was no the shoulder blade thwack of hitting hard bone. There was nothing like that. It was just sticking out of him. So I was up in my stand, and I was just trying to figure out like what happened, So I waited a little bit, and when I got down, I went from like a very low emotion to then a very high one, and seeing a lot of bubbly lung blood, um, like quite a bit. And so I was just like, okay, maybe I'm just seeing this weird. Maybe he did turn, or maybe I don't know. But I've got bright red, frothy blood, and there is quite a bit of it. And then I found my arrow, and it had just my arrow actually looked like perfect. And the blood on the shaft wasn't up very high, but it was it was bright and bubbly. It was probably, I don't know, 10 inches of penetration, 8 to 10, something like that. And the broadhead looked totally fine. Nothing was bent, nothing was broken. It had just kind of pulled out of him. And as we started to track, my buddy Nick came and helped me. He saw that, and we were both kind of like, man, I think, maybe I'm just not seeing what I thought I saw. This looks great. And that feeling of this looks great, every 50 yards was once again feeling less great, because we're like, this buck has to be in this next thicket. Okay, he's got to be in this one. He's got to be in this one. Long story short, this deer went 1.5 miles on a single lung hit, is what we had kind of finally determined. We came to that determination by we called a tracking dog, and the guy was unavailable. He's a great guy. His name's Scott Phillips. If any Michigan hunters are in need of a tracking dog, he's awesome. And he had basically said, on a single lung hit, my recommendation, whether or not this is what you guys would do, is to continue to push that deer. So what you don't want him to do is you don't want him to bed and lay down on that wound and clot it up, because you'll find that bed, but then after that you won't find any blood. He basically said a deer can live for a long time on a single lung hit, and what you want to do is you want to keep him moving. You want to keep blood flowing. You want to keep him from clotting, and eventually kind of wear him out. And that sounded super counterintuitive, and just the thought of having to do that and probably have to, it's almost like if I was fortunate enough to achieve that and wear this deer out, I'm going to have to shoot him again, likely. So I was sick to my stomach. We did that. It was working. We would find a bed, and, we bumped him. The first few, we didn't know we bumped him, but we did. And then blood would pick back up again. By the, I don't know, 4th, 5th, 6th bed, we were hearing the deer run off. And the very last one, as blood was kind of dwindling, we got up to a thicket, and he jumped up, and he was like right next to us. I didn't see him, but he was in this thicket probably 15 yards away, and we were in some pretty gnarly stuff, but he was going towards an opening, and I ran around, drew my bow back, and by the time I did, he was gone again. And I mean, after 1.5 miles, he was still moving like I hadn't even touched him, which was just crazy. And so I know we were talking about broadheads, or that was the topic for this, but I kind of wanted to lay out how I got to where I'm at now, and how I think the way that I think, because I have definitely failed in the bow hunting woods, and I want to just share that with you guys. So after that, I was like, okay, something has to change. Something really has to change. And we had the ranch fairy on this podcast before, and it was, I found him, and he had a similar story, and I started then doing the things that he does, and about that time too, I was taking a liking and an interest more into crossbow hunting, but I did his system, his arrow tuning and bolt tuning system for both a compound and a crossbow. And I guess the first thing that really shocked me with that was just, you can get a fixed blade to fly. But what I also started realizing was just some of these factors that he considered and that Dr. Ashby considered that I had never ever really considered before in regards to arrow or bolt lethality. Um, a couple of those were structural integrity. Um, that was one I'd never really analyzed a broadhead before for structural integrity. I kind of looked at it as like I like chisel tips. I kind of like a sleeker ferrule, and I like a fairly big cutting diameter. Well, when he started talking about structural integrity, I started looking at the rage heads that I was shooting or some other mechanicals that I had around. I was like, gosh, those are not as structurally sound as a fixed blade. I also had never considered edge retention or how sharp you really need to have a broadhead for hunting. I always thought stuff out of the package was sharp enough. Like, oh yeah, that's sharp enough. That'll kill a deer. And I never, I guess, considered that your broadhead is going to dull as it goes through said deer, and it's really like its sharpness from the time it leaves your bow um, to the time it gets into the vitals is only going to deteriorate. It's not going to get better. That was one that I had just I'd never thought of it that way. And I was like, wow, that, you know, probably some of these, track jobs when things even didn't break, my blades they probably weren't sharp enough to begin with. And then by the time they got to vitals, they probably weren't that sharp to do the cutting damage that I wanted them to do. Um, and then another one was just, basically penetration and how important getting as much penetration as you can is. So I was definitely on the cutting diameter over penetration side of things. And I guess my reasoning for that was I was always more worried about hitting back on a deer than I was hitting high or hitting hard bone. And as some of these issues or these, failed hunts or failed recoveries started happening, um, and especially after that one long mile and a half one, I really, that was kind of an eye-opening thing where I was like, cutting diameter on these is not mattering. It's not helping me. I'm not getting penetration and I'm not hitting these deer back. Some I'm hitting high based on how the deer is reacting, or like that doe, a fairly or mostly broadside shot turned into a quartering two, and I got enough to kill her, but I didn't get a ton. I was never hitting deer back ever. The only deer I ever hit back was one that had deflected off of a stick, and I actually found her. It was a doe that I hit. I mean, I thought it was like the worst looking shot I've ever had in my life. Like, I hit her right in front of her rear legs. This was with a crossbow too. It had just deflected off of a twig from a ground blind that I didn't see, and it was an easy chip shot, 20-yard shot, and I just watched my Luminot stick right in front of her rear legs, right in her guts. Um, I was sick. I was like, oh, well, we probably won't find that one. Didn't have any blood. I backed out. I didn't even track. I came back the next morning and she was probably 80 yards from where I shot her. Didn't push her, didn't do anything. She was dead in her first bed. So that was the only time I had never pulled a shot back. I'd actually never really pull the shot really forward either. I was always having issues that were highs really, or some maybe I shot a little high, some the deer reacting, others the deer reacting um, and turning, but I wasn't hitting them in the guts. And so the penetration aspect of things then really started to resonate with me, and how getting all the way through a deer, having two holes in the deer for tracking instead of one. Um, that that was a big one, and that was an eye opener. So I think, what it comes down to when we talk about broadheads for a crossbow is, I think it really is, what are you most worried about if things go wrong? Um, if you say, I am most worried about hitting a deer in the guts, like I was, then, a mechanical might be a better option, just based on there is pretty much just hide and soft tissue back there. You're not going through ribs. Um, and, I think having a bigger cutting diameter, if you're going, like if you were going to purposefully shoot a deer in the guts, I pray to God, or I hope no one ever does that. And I don't think anyone ever would. But if you were going to, and you had to say, Matt, what would you pick if you're going to shoot a deer right in the guts? Would you pick this 2-inch expandable, or would you pick this inch to the 16th fixed blade? I'm probably going to pick the expandable. If I'm going to hit something back there, I want a big cut. But I think a lot of people, or I guess me, I experienced hitting bones, experienced hitting high, and I experienced lack of penetration. Those were the things that were causing me issues and not hitting back. And when you see stuff on Facebook or on Instagram or forums or whatever, a lot of people like to say, gosh, people need to stop worrying so much about bolt weights or broadheads or whatever. You just got to hit them in the right spot. And there's some truth to that. I don't think anything. I think the number one thing is shot placement. 100%. I don't doubt that. If you just straight plug a deer, it's probably not going to matter what you're shooting. I don't deny that at all. But what I think, is we actually don't have control over where we hit a deer. And what I mean by that is we have control of where we aim, and we have control of taking a good quality ethical shot angle at an ethical distance. But we really don't actually have control of where that bolt or where that arrow is going to hit. Because as soon as it leaves your bow, or as soon as it leaves your crossbow, you could have squeezed off the most perfect shot in the world, but while that bolt or while that arrow is flying, the deer is in control. The deer can move. Some do, some don't. But in that short window of time, the deer is in control. And now, obviously, close shots, right? That deer doesn't have a whole lot of time to be in control. And the chances of it reacting fast enough to make a drastic impact on your shot, especially with a crossbow at 15 yards, right? You're probably going to hit exactly where you're shooting at. But when you get to that 30, 35, 40, or maybe some of you guys that feel comfortable shooting farther than 40, if you're in the 50, maybe even 60 range, which I'm personally not, but if that's where you're at, that's cool. You don't have control while that thing is flying. And most of the time, when you're out of control and that deer hears something or is already alert or whatever, typical reaction is going to be to duck, to load up their legs and get ready to bolt for cover because they heard what they think is danger or something that surprised them, right? And most of the time when that happens, it results in a shot that is either going to be higher, where you're getting into some shoulder blades, or a turn where you're getting into shoulder blades, maybe even that front leg. And that is where, I now think penetration outside of shot placement, penetration is key. Actually, I should probably back up. Shot placement's number one. I would say like the other two, I'm going to put them kind of both in the same boat, is the structural integrity and penetration. I definitely think there are some deer that I lost that I can't guarantee I would have recovered them, but I can guarantee I would have had a better chance shooting a fixed blade. So I am now, at least right now, I am definitely on the fixed blade side of things, especially because you can get fixed blades to fly really, really well. You do have to spend some time to do it, and you have to tune things, but you can get them to fly pretty dang close to your field points, to the point where a small scope adjustment is not a big deal, or to the point where your shooting capabilities, they're probably not flying different enough than your field points for your shooting capabilities to even really notice it. And that's totally fine. That's how it is for me. I'm definitely not the best shot in the world, but I can now make a fairly large fixed blade in something like a cutthroat or a Magnus Stinger or something of that nature hit a 2-inch circle at 40 yards. Edge retention is another thing that I think needs to be considered. With those big fixed blades, when those things deploy, or sorry, not big fixed blades, big mechanicals, when those deploy, those blades come out, and you have that very steep blade angle basically smacking right into the side of that deer, it's going to put some stress on that cutting edge for sure, with it being just wide and steeper. So you kind of have to play the balance game of, do you want that bigger cutting diameter, and maybe you're shoving we'll just say a duller blade into the vitals when it gets there? Like, is bigger and duller give you more confidence, or does smaller, sharper, more gradual? Because I do think, you know, kind of bucketing these into that, just fixed blades versus mechanicals, I think you are going to have better edge retention based on your blade angle with a fixed blade than you are a mechanical. And one thing that I noticed too, and last year is really only my data point, but others have talked about this, and the Ranch Fairy has talked about this. One thing that I noticed, but I never, I guess, really thought much of it, was even if I had just shots where I smoked deer with those mechanicals and I had a big old gushing blood trail, I never saw a deer fall in sight. And granted, I hunt some pretty thick stuff normally, but I never saw any of them, not that I can remember, go down. They always took off, and we were usually in the, I don't know, 100 to 150 yards. We'll say that, or 80 to 150 yards was like normal. And anything beyond that kind of made you worry a little bit. The deer that I shot last year with that cutthroat, he took like 4 bounds. I honestly, I mean, he was 5 yards away, and when his reaction, I almost thought I missed him. And it, obviously, like, you should never miss one that close, but he was so big in my crossbow scope, I was having a hard time finding his shoulder and finding where I needed to aim. So I honestly thought at first, like, oh my God, I just missed a buck at 5 yards with a crossbow. I'm an idiot. And he stood there for a couple seconds. His tail started to flicker, and he tipped over. I'd never seen that before. Um, and the ranch fairy and others talk about those blades deploy, and you kind of get that thwack a little bit, and all of a sudden that deer is hit with a 2-inch cutting diameter. They notice it, and it startles them. And even if you plug them, they think they know something happened, and they just tear off like a bat out of hell. With some of the fixed blades, and especially, obviously get them really sharp, but with that smaller cutting diameter with that more gradual blade angle, I don't think that deer even really noticed anything happen. They zip right through them, and it's probably more like I don't know, a bee sting or something, maybe not even that, versus this big thing like, whoa, what the heck just hit me in the rib cage? And that was definitely apparent on my buck last year. And I will take that. And there wasn't a ton of blood. I followed. I just kind of wanted to see what it looked like to where he was laying, and it was a fine blood trail. It wasn't a gusher like a mechanical, but to watch them fall and not have to track was like, holy cow, this is fantastic. And I wasn't the only one actually that had that happen last year with my group of friends. Another guy that's been on a couple one lung rodeos with deer, shooting kind of basically the same setup as I was for a long time. He had one that he shot with what was it? It was an iron will that went like 25 or 30 yards. It just kind of took a couple hops, did the same thing, stood there, flickered its tail, and fell over. So, another argument that I see a lot of times for the mechanical is the better blood trail. Um, I would definitely now, having had some great blood trails, even that resulted in no deer, I would not worry about how much blood it's going to put down on the ground, because you really can't control that. It depends on what you hit on the inside, depends on how sharp your blades are in there. Um, at this stage in the game, and seeing the differences between mechanical hit deer, both recovered and not recovered, and my fixed blade killed buck last year and a couple of my buddies, I will take a potentially weaker blood trail with that fixed blade to trade off for the deer reacting less severely once they're hit and traveling less of a distance, as opposed to the bigger cutting diameter that's going to give me a better chance of a bigger blood trail, but also give me a better chance of the deer traveling farther based on how he reacts to that shot. One last thing in regards to mechanicals versus fixed blade, and this kind of goes more to the mechanical side of things, is the shot angle consideration. So, this really became a thing that I now look at after that one lung hit, after where the arrow was like parallel to the deer's body. Just know that, and granted, I know that I didn't recover this deer, and I don't know 100% what happened, but I'm fairly confident this is what happened. Was when those blades started to deploy on that deer quartering away, and instead of the ribs, being perpendicular to where my arrow is going, they're now kind of stacked in a line. I think what happened is one of the blades basically started to open before the other one, and that just caused the arrow to turn and run up the near side of him. And I've heard that from a lot of other people, where you got to be a little more picky as far as, even if it's a quartering away shot, the chances of a kind of redirected shot is higher with a mechanical, just because you have things opening and moving. Not to say that it'll happen every time, not to say that it can't happen with a fixed blade, but the chances of it happening with a mechanical are higher than that of a fixed blade. So just know that. I would lean more toward the straight broadside shots, if you can. I know some mechanicals have kind of more of like a leading point to help alleviate that, like the point starts to penetrate before you start getting blade deployment. I definitely think that helps. But just in general, when things are moving and one thing is moving before the other thing, you certainly have a risk of a redirected or deflected or whatever you want to call it shot when you're shooting mechanical. All right, everybody. Now you all know where my head's at and how I got here and the success I had, the failures that I had, the things that I noticed and experienced that ultimately led me to the factors that I consider and the things that now give me more confidence going into the woods. And that really is the key. I want you all to be confident in the head that is at the end of your bolt or arrow. Whether you consider things or view things differently than I do, that is totally fine. I want you to be confident in what you hunt with. For me, it is now a fixed blade, especially now that I feel confident in my ability to get that fixed blade to fly well. That was a big thing for me. And now seeing how a deer reacts to being shot with a super sharp quality fixed blade versus some of the very successful kills that I had with a mechanical, I will gladly take the what I saw last year in 2020 on my buck versus what I've seen in the past with mechanicals. And again, I'm not bashing mechanicals. I'm not bashing the Rage 2 blade. I've honestly probably killed more with that Rage 2 blade than any other broadhead combined. But the factors that I consider important, penetration, structural integrity, edge retention, those I feel more confident in a quality fixed blade than I do that Rage again. And it could be completely different for you. And that's, what I want to hear from you guys. This is where in that comment section I want some good, meat on the bones, good context comments down in that comment section so we can all learn from each other. You guys don't have to learn just from me. I want to learn from you too, or I want other people to learn from you. So please, down below, tell me what it is you shoot and tell me why it is that you shoot it and what factors went into your head or what experiences did you have that led you to choosing that broadhead, and why does it make you confident, and what plan B scenario worries you most, and how does that broadhead mitigate those worries for you. That's what I want to see from you guys, because I think this could be a really great, positive, no bashing, open discussion about broadheads, something I rarely see. That's what I would love to see down in the comments below. Regardless of whether you go fixed blade or mechanical, I think there's a few factors that everybody should consider. Structural integrity. There are fixed blades that are more structurally sound than others. Same thing for mechanicals. There are more mechanicals that are more structurally sound than others. Blade sharpness. Get those suckers really sharp. Take a little time, even if they feel really sharp out of the package. I'm telling you, just a cheap strap off of Amazon, touch those blades up right out of the package, you would be amazed at how much sharper they can get if they're already pretty darn sharp. Shot placement, obviously, but ethical shot angles, ethical shot distances, and just remember, you have control over your aiming point. But as soon as that bolt or that arrow takes flight, you are out of control. And if plan B happens, I want you to be as confident as possible that the head that you have chosen is going to do what you expect it to do. And if you are looking for some really good, I think really good broadhead reviews, side by side comparisons shooting into the same test protocol, if you want to call it, and test mediums, give Lusk Archery Adventures, check them out. Give them some of your time, because John Lusk at Lusk Archery Adventures, he has done a really good job, I think, of side by side comparisons, testing a bunch of different broadheads through the exact same type of tests, looking at things like penetration, durability, edge retention, structural integrity, both fixed and mechanicals. They're not on live animals or on, animals that he's harvested. That can be a difficult thing to do, is to replicate the exact same shot for two different broadheads. But the test mediums that he's chosen and how he breaks down the results is very useful. And I think you guys will be able to pick out, be it fixed blade or mechanical, what the right broadhead is for you based on the factors that you consider are important. And by all means, if you want to email me, please shoot me an email, draggindeer@gmail.com. I'd be happy to help you out if I can, or if you want to know exactly what heads or head that I'm going to go with for 2021, be happy to tell you. And if you want to hear something else on this podcast, give me some suggestions. I'd love to hear from you guys. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoyed this episode of the Bent Limbs podcast. Y'all have a great night, and we'll see you next time.